Learning from the Vietnamese and Giving. Dick Hughes. I've personally known Dick Hughes for years as a wonderfully talented actor. He graduated Carnegie Mellon Drama School at the time when men were being drafted to serve in Vietnam. Dick was deeply troubled by the Vietnam War, and in the middle of the height of the war in 1968, Dick got his draft card and decided to go to Vietnam by paying his own way to Saigon in search of some alternative service he could do. Confronted by bands of street children orphaned by the war, on the first day in the country, he helped them find food and safe shelter with money from cashing in his return plane ticket. Dubbed the Shoeshine Boys Project, it grew to 8 safe houses that Dick ran in Saigon and Da Nang until after the war ended. As a matter of fact, Dick was one of the last to serve in Vietnam in 1975. He has returned in 2001, 2007, and last year in 2016 to continue his efforts to ease the pain of war. As I said earlier, I am deeply honored to introduce Dick Hughes, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. I told Carol her husband's speaking next week. David Garcia, very soothing music. Thank you. So this is, I'm Dick Hughes, and this is Veterans Day weekend. So I think we should probably, excuse me, recognize or ask all those during that era who were draft dodgers to raise their hand, and we'll give them a round of applause. Kidding. But speaking of Veterans Day weekend, I'll divert for just a quick second. Yesterday on C-SPAN, for 48 hours, they were running all things Vietnam. They were running footage of the war, they were running protest march things, etc. And I was just struck by one story I want to share with you in particular before I get into the my little short presentation. But it was a gathering in Washington of people who went to the march on the Pentagon on October 20th, 50 years ago in 1967. And these were people who had now gathered in Washington this past October, and they were giving testimony about what happened to them when they marched on the Pentagon, when Jerry Rubin and the Yippies were going to levitate the Pentagon. Noam Chomsky and Dr. Spock and Norman Mailer all got arrested, et cetera, et cetera. And he was just a young fellow. This fellow's name was Bill Ramsey, and he was from North Carolina, and he came up for the march. And he was with a group that actually got around to the back of the Pentagon, and they actually got right up on the steps to the doors when some soldiers came out and blocked their way. And he talked about what they did in relation to the soldiers and back and forth, and he mentioned that one famous iconic photo, I think many of you probably seen, of a young woman sticking a flower in the barrel of a soldier's rifle. And then he said it was time for me to go, and I went over hill and dale and jumped a wall and got on the street and put out my finger to hitchhike. And a car stopped, and I got in, and the driver was a young man, and he said, where are you going? Oh, he said, I'm going to North Carolina. Oh, good, he said, I'm going to Camp Lejeune. Now, for those who don't know, Camp Lejeune is a very famous Marine base. And he thought, oh, this is going to either be a long ride with contentious chat, or it's going to be a very short ride for me. And he said, where are you coming from? And this gentleman, Bill Ramsey, said, I said, almost below a murmur, the Pentagon. And he said, great, I just came from there, he said. I have to go to Vietnam in a week. And I thought this was my last chance, maybe my only chance, to express my feelings about the war in Vietnam. Excuse me, the war in Vietnam. And he said, I realized then that it was going to take the cooperation of those who served and those who protested together to help bring this war to an end. So I share that with you because I think it's a great, true and great story. I was contacted some years back by the History Channel. They were doing, the 60s, they were doing Vietnam, excuse me, and they had set up a formula for a piece they wanted to do, which was they wanted to get 3 people who had served in Vietnam, and they wanted to get 3 people who had refused to go, and bring them together years later, and bring them down to the wall down in Washington, and film them together and discussing things. And I said to this young lady who was the producer there, she said, we read about your story and wondered if you would be a part of this. And I said, I would be happy to be a part of this. There's just one small problem. I refused to go, and I went. She said, oh, right. Yeah, I have to talk to my producer. Let me get back to you, which she eventually did, and I was part of that program. But that's kind of a lead into what my story is about, which is, as excuse me, Carol mentioned, I went to Carnegie Mellon drama, and then went to Boston University Graduate School, and I got a job with the Theater Company of Boston. It was my first professional job. John Voight was there, Dustin Hoffman. It was a great crowd. They later brought some plays to Broadway, Richard III with Al Pacino, and Training of Pablo Hummel, which is a Vietnam play by David Rabe. So I was feeling pretty good. Carnegie was one of the finest drama schools in the country at that time. This was before Juilliard and Yale. And I really was on a roll for a new career. But the Vietnam War was constantly on television, in the news, and I was really having trouble concentrating on my work with what was going on in Vietnam. Thank you. This vodka? Yeah. Thank you. So I got a draft notice. I had been a conscientious objector, and you have to choose 2 years of alternate service. When I looked through the book that they sent me, I was stunned to see that there were some theaters as alternative service, including the Theater Company of Boston that I was working at. So I got the business manager to send a letter to the draft board about alternative service. Well, I'm from Pittsburgh. There's not many dummies over there, and they went, right. Alternative service at the Theater Company of Boston? I don't think so. And so they sent me a draft notice, but I had to decide at that point what to do. And so I decided, with the help of the Boston Draft Resistance Group, to go down to the Army base to give the colonel there a letter that I was refusing induction. And then I would go to Vietnam on my own, which I did. I went through the draft physical, etc. I left. I called the federal attorney and said, now what? He said, oh, well, the FBI has to do a routine investigation. Are you sure you want to do this? I said, why? He said, oh, I have so many cases on my desk. You know, this is quite a workload. I said, oh, I'm really sorry. But yeah, I think I'm going to go through with this. He said, well, they have to interview you or your family, and then They'll send it to me and I'll decide if we're going to indict you or not. Until that time, you're free to go anywhere you want. I didn't say where I was going to go. The Boston University News, which was getting thicker every week because of the war and their coverage of it, had done a story on my refusal, and they gave me a letter of accreditation so that I could go to Vietnam as a journalist. There were no jobs for actors in the war zone, and UNICEF, CARE, were not going to hire an actor, so that was the only way I could get to go there. I didn't tell my family I was going because I thought they will tackle me and I'll never get out the door. I went to California. I borrowed some money for a round trip, Pan Am at that time, a flight, and I flew to Saigon. When I landed, the main airport was Tan Son Nhut Airport, and everybody on that flight was either military or press or diplomatic, and they all had cars and jeeps waiting for them, and they all disappeared, and there I was standing alone in the Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon with some Vietnamese taxi drivers offering to send me, take me into town, not knowing where to go, and I saw a phone on the wall. And I thought, oh, maybe that's a car service or something. So I didn't realize that the letters underneath MACV were MACV. Vietnam was the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. It was the headquarters for the American military mission. I picked up the phone and said, hi, just checking about trying to get some transport into Saigon. Yes, sir, what's your unit? Excuse me? What's your unit, sir? We can't provide transportation unless you know your unit. I was tempted to say, do you transport conscious objectives? So I said, oh no, thank you very much. I hung up and I went into Saigon. The taxi drivers didn't know what the press center was where I had to go get my accreditation. So they dropped me in front of a large building with parapets and barbed wire, and because they thought that's a good start. It turned out it was the American Embassy. It had been right after the Tet Offensive of 1968. It looked pretty forbidding. So another driver took me over to where the Rex Hotel was, and there was a press center there. And I sat down and I started looking through my papers to get my accreditation stuff out, and I looked over and I saw a group of young kids in shorts and t-shirts and shoe shine boxes off to the side, and they were playing and wrestling and like that. And I went back to my papers, and all of a sudden I felt a presence right in front of me. And I looked up, and there was this little guy, one of these shoe shine kids, looking at me very sternly. And he said, like a state trooper who pulls you over, in English, what's your name? And before I could answer, he said, are you civilian or GI? I said, oh, my name is Dick. I'm a civilian. And he dashed off because I didn't have the boots to shine to play with the kid. But that was planted the seed for what I thought I was going to do if I wanted to try to do something to help the people of Vietnam. I did get my accreditation. I found an apartment with another journalist where we could live, and also if I wanted these kids to get some help, they could come down there. I also traveled out into the combat zones. With a press card, you could fly on military aircraft, you could go on military missions, and you could sleep in military housing. And I, the second week up there, went to Con Thien. Con Thien was just below the demilitarized zone. Featured a lot on the news this weekend in C-SPAN. And it was a very small base, right at the DMZ. The North Vietnamese sat across the way with binoculars, and when someone got up to walk from one bunker to another, you'd hear mortars popping. So you didn't have time to get to the other bunker. You had to jump in ditches, which they had dug between the two. And I had, by virtue of being a journalist, the use of the APO mailing service. So I sent a postcard home to my family saying, I'm at Con Thien. I had told them when I first got to Saigon, guess where I am. And they had been very good and supportive about it. But I sent a postcard saying, I'm at Con Thien. I'm going to be very careful. I won't be here too long, and I'll write you when I get back. But at that time, Con Tien was on the front page of Life magazine, in all the news. It was the hot spot in Vietnam. And lo and behold, it was right at that time that the FBI came knocking at the door of my father's office. He was in city government in Pittsburgh, and said, Mr. Hughes, and introduced themselves, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your son, Richard. Yes, yes, come in, he said, and sat down. Okay, they took out their notebooks, and they said, you're aware that Richard refused induction up in Boston, correct? And he said, yes. Okay, just a few questions. He said, how old is Richard? He says, he's 24. He says, what's his current address? He said, I believe it's Con Tien, South Vietnam. The FBI fellow said, excuse me? He said, yeah, and he took out the postcard and he handed it to them and he said, there, it's Con Tien, South Vietnam. And the first fellow looked at it, he handed it to his partner, he looked at it. They closed their notebooks, they said, thank you, Mr. Hughes, there's no more questions. And they left. Long story short, the federal attorney, when he found that out, dropped the case, and they reinstated my conscientious objector status, and it was over. Mike Foley, a professor at Staten Island, wrote a book on draft resistance later, and he tracked down that federal attorney who was retired in Boston. And he said, yeah, I wasn't going to prosecute because I thought he was sincere in his intentions. But the second day we were at Con Tien, the colonel sent me out on a mission during the day which he thought there would be no military activity. And the opposite happened. We walked into an ambush, 3 machine guns in an L-shaped ambush. We got pinned down. I was lying in a foxhole with a radio operator bleeding from the head, and a corporal came running back to me, and he handed me a cocked .45. And he said, they're coming up on the rear. As soon as you see them, start firing. What is wrong with this picture? A conscientious objector in a foxhole at Con Tien holding a cocked .45. You can imagine all the thoughts that go through your heads. I'll kill myself, I'll kill them, I won't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fortunately, they didn't come up on the rear. We were able to evacuate to a ditch, and eventually the North Vietnamese turned around and went in the opposite direction. One young man was killed, a couple were injured. His name was Carlton Frost. His name is on the wall in Washington. And a young man from Newcastle who was assigned my bodyguard because I didn't carry a weapon. Larry Reed is also on the wall. He didn't get hurt in that action. But a week later, when I came back to visit the unit, one of the fellows told me he died in my arms yesterday in a combat battle. I was in combat because I wanted to test my beliefs and my feelings, which in Boston were much easier to come to than they would be under fire. They weren't changed, they were strengthened. And I thought that was something important to do. So for a good portion of my time in Vietnam, I did travel with different troops and units to see the war up close and personal. But we also invited 11 of these street children to come down to our house, and they would always go, yeah, we will. And then one day I think they got bored. They came down in the middle of the day. They came in and looked around this house and all the tile floors. They said, can we use your shower? I said, yeah, sure, go ahead. Minutes later, water came streaming out across the whole apartment onto the floor. They were sliding around on bare bottoms, on tiles, and waving it out the windows to people, just to have a good time. But they came back that night and they stayed. There was a military curfew at that time, so we all had to be in first at 4 o'clock and then at 6 and 8, etc. And we lived together for a year in a very close family fashion, ate together and slept together, showered, and lived really like a family. In the morning they would go out to work, I would go out to work, come back in the evening. Nobody had any money, so we all shared what we could pull together. But in that course of that year, I got not only, well, I got an education in so many different ways. They put me to the test like kids do to adults. Do you know what you're getting into, and et cetera, et cetera. But I also began to see how deep their anguish was. That even though they seemed like adults, and even though they seemed like they could handle anything, when I would ask them about going to school, they say, "School? What for? I'm going to work. I don't go to school," etc. But altercations would happen. There would be a fight or something, and when you separate them, it would take one of them much longer to stop crying, not because of that fight, but because of their history. And one day I came in, the youngest boy, who had a tape wrapped around a swollen arm that he had somehow injured. He was crying because some of the older boys wouldn't let him in the card game, and the more he protested, the more they teased. And he really started crying, and I took him in to the adjacent bathroom. I closed the door, and I embraced him and tried to put some soothing sounds into his ear just to calm him down. And his crying went from a loud kind of into a deep sobbing cry, and he pulled back from me. And he took the tape off his arm, and he started slamming his arm against this door. And I took him and I held him and tried to soothe him, and I thought, if you want to help these children, their pain is very deep. This is serious business. And so, fortunately at that time, another social agency, much larger than ours, came and said, we had tried this project, didn't work, we have 3 children, could you take them? And we have a student who, will be on salary, will pay for it, and he could help you. And so the first student came in, and he brought in other students. I moved out, and they opened a second home for children in the first home who wanted to end their shoe shine business and go into a life with work, school, live as a family. And eventually, as Carol had said, we had 6 homes in Saigon, 2 in Da Nang, helping 2,500 children over the course of the war. It was a great project, and it was an entirely Vietnamese-run project. And that kind of arcs into the work we're doing today. We have a little nonprofit called Loose Cannons, just so we don't take ourselves too seriously. And we're trying to get help for Vietnamese who've been afflicted by Agent Orange. Right now, some 3 million people there. But it's also our belief that this can be done by the Vietnamese, and they need the support. When the first student came in, the shoeshine kids would not talk to him. He sat there beside me, and finally a delegation of 3 of them came up to me and said, pointing to him, "Who's that?" I said, "Oh, a friend of mine." "Is he staying here?" I said, "Yeah." "If he stays here, we go." "Really? Why?" "He's Vietnamese." "He's Vietnamese." I said, "Yeah. Any Vietnamese is no good." I said, "Well, you don't know him." "No, it doesn't matter. We're leaving." And they went and got all their shoeshine boxes and blankets. "Bye." And he didn't know what was going on. And they marched out. And I had just decided I was going to stay in Vietnam as long as it took to turn this into a real project. Now they were leaving. And they would look back in every once in a while and they would say, you know, we're leaving. I said, "Yes, you told me you're leaving." Well, there was a military curfew, so they couldn't go look for a new home. So they came back in. They said, "Okay, we're sleeping with our box and blankets, everything right here on the floor, and in the morning, we're gone." I said, "Okay." Still didn't speak to them. In the morning, they put their boxes, things back in, blankets and things, and went to work. They came back, and gradually that evening, they started talking to him. And eventually, he sat them down, about 22 at this point, in rows, and he started to talk to them where they came from, combat zones, if they had any family left, etc. And then he said, "How many of you would like to go to school?" Every single one of them raised their hand. He said, okay, and if we get some help from Dick, maybe we can go out to the highway with a truck swimming, or there's a swimming hole, etc. They started to raise their hand. I said, yeah, and we could do this too, we could do that too. And I looked at them and I went, my God, these are just kids. For 1 year, I had been living with adults, and for the first time, I was seeing the children inside them. So that was the start of the success of that Shoeshine Boys project. I came back in 76, went back into acting, and in 2005 came across a book about Agent Orange, a photography book by Philip Jones Griffiths. It was a very powerful book. I needed more volunteer work in my life, like I needed a hole in the head. But I couldn't, looking at those photos and realizing the contacts I had in the press world and diplomatic world, I thought, I'd be remiss if I didn't jump in. So there's information on what we're doing over there. I recently wrote a op-ed piece in the New York Times with Viet Thanh Nguyen. He was the author of The Sympathizer, the book that got the Pulitzer Prize. We had a profile on PBS NewsHour. I did the WNYC Brian Lear show, and we're getting some momentum, ironically, because of the Burns Novak documentary that just came out. So I urge you to take a look at that material if you can. Take as many copies as you want, and try to, my card is there. We're trying to spread the word to try to get help. You know, the byproduct of Agent Orange was dioxin. I don't know if some of you remember Elizabeth Taylor's ads about diamonds. Years ago, diamonds, darling, are forever. But you could substitute dioxin. It's still there. It has a very strong afterlife. And people are being born now with horrible deformities and illnesses. So the last thing I would leave you with, when I came back from Vietnam, I was asked to write an op-ed piece about my experience in Vietnam. And I had a lot of trouble doing it because I didn't know exactly what I wanted to say. And I kept tearing the pages out of the typewriter. Remember the typewriter? And finally, I just started to take anecdotes about what happened to the street kids. And about 2/3 of the way through the piece, I found out what I wanted to say. So I'm going to read that for you now. It's called Learning from the Vietnamese and Giving. And 2/3 of the way through, you'll hear what I wanted to say. In February 1970, 7 months before he was accidentally crushed to death in Saigon by a 16-wheel American military vehicle, Min the Cripple, nicknamed for his deformity by the other dust of life street children, smiled and whispered into my ear from atop his perch on my back, where he often rode. You know why I learned to do back wheel spins and tricks on my bicycle? Because when everyone sees me, they say, wow, and they forget about my small legs. In a society so devastated, Min was one of thousands of victims with secrets and private dreams. In his wallet, he carried a 1 piastre note upon which he'd written, how many drops of tears, how many drops of sweat. He learned to write at our Pham Ngu Lao street boy house, late at night, after showering and moving about on his strong arms and hands to clean all the floors, and sitting against his immaculate footlocker desk, he'd write the Vietnamese alphabet and chirp a cricket song, a song he made up, while the other boys smiled with their eyes shut. In June, 2 months before he was killed, there was an unsuccessful suicide attempt. In his note, which he had wrapped around his finger like a ring, after having crushed all the tablets for easier swallowing, Min asked my student helper and me why the police find any excuse to arrest me. On that particular day, they had taken his bicycle again. He was too proud and too angry to pay the bribe, and the bribe demands never stopped. So many times before, they had taken him in, beaten his chest and abdomen with blackjacks, and placing him on the cement in the noonday sun, said, "Can you swim? Let's see the breaststroke." Fortunately, they did not beat him that day. He did not intend to give them an opportunity to do so again. "I believe I was possibly born in Saigon," he said in a recorded interview after returning from the hospital 2 days later, where he had come out of a coma at 3 a.m. and slurred amid the sobs, "I told you, Dick. I told you so. I told you I'd kill myself," he meant. Back at Famgulau House, hours after Min's street boy funeral on August 23, 1970, the House leader read Min's interview for the first time. Then he searched the Webster's dictionary looking for a word. He put it back down. Perhaps I thought he hadn't found the word. He was looking away in silence. And then, in halting English, I think he was oppressed all his life. Outside the room, another boy, wanting Min back, was scrawling in chalk on a black aluminum locker, "Someone please go buy for me a cricket." Throughout those years, their words went on and on. "Older brother, I never had a home. Why, they even still ask me, when did I leave home? My parents are no more. Why am I even asked why I still do not live with them? When I could reason, I knew I was among the lost children." Their tattoos: "Weep for those just born. Life is a scabies. Men of this world are flies. And adore and respect parents." No amount of stomach pumping could save the street boy, Nhi the cripple. There were so many cripples. "Older brother Tuan, I write for you this letter today, when my mind it seems miserable. Please try to understand for me. Goodbye, Nhi." At a different Saigon graveyard in 1971, Hom, our first street boy, a veritable Jiminy Cricket, stood in bare feet, shorts and t-shirt, his small skinny body quaking as his stepfather, a beggar, howled inside the cemetery over Hom's mother's opium-filled, tuberculosis-ridden corpse. "Please, Dick, take me to school tomorrow," Hom said, struggling in English, as we held hands and walked along mud trenches out to the main road. Wide-eyed and taut, he forced a smile. Amid all the carnage, they still insisted on having a childhood. I owe the people of Vietnam so much. They have reordered my life by teaching me simplicity, brotherhood, how to touch, and a reason for carrying on, that it does count. Are we really not going to help them rebuild? When they have such spiritual resources for rebuilding our nation and healing the wounds, are we not going to share? At Christmas dinner in 1975, Zung Din Tao, chief of Saigon City's Foreign Affairs section under the new constitutional government, interrupted my comments on the dust of life children to interject, "If you love them, you can do everything. Without it, you can do nothing." It was a response I had been seeking for 7 years from just any one official in the former regime. It had never come. Talk of money, yes. Trips abroad, yes, but never love. When my scheduled flight left Tan Son Nhut Airport on April 7, 1976, I not only felt a debt to the Vietnamese people, I knew the kids I loved were finally finding people who cared. The post-war problems we often only give lip service to are, in fact, enormous. I saw them. Without resources, the Vietnamese people's suffering continues. And I'm at a loss how to tell my own people that Vietnam's needs are our remedy. to say that what the Vietnamese people have to offer us, as they did me, is so great that for our own sake, we must help them. So thanks for coming today. Thank you, Kara.